stand behind the pulpit, which I've done for most of the last 40 years, is stand behind the pulpit, but sometimes I'm more comfortable out here, and I hope that's okay with you folks. Luke chapter 6 is the setting for what we call the Sermon on the Level Place. The Sermon on the Plain. Jesus has called his disciples. They were up on a mountain together, according to Luke chapter 6, when they were called. As if the disciples, he gathered them all there, he called them by name. As if on the mountain he could look out across and they could see the terrain of their future ministry. But then it says they descended from the mountain to a level place. And all the people gathered around them. And they came with a great crowd from all across the area, from Judea to the south, Jerusalem, and from Tyre and Sidon. They were on the coastland near the Sea of Galilee. And they all came, and many were healed. And then Jesus began to teach them. The Sermon on the Level Place. On the level place, we don't know as much about that as we do about the Sermon on the Mount, which we find in Matthew chapter 5, verse 7. The Sermon on the Plain is a parallel with the Sermon on the Mount, except it's much shorter and more abridged, and not as well known or well remembered as the Sermon on the Mount. Now, when you go to the Holy Land and visit, your tour guide will be glad to show you a place where the traditional site of the Sermon on the Mount was placed. But there's no place that they won't gather you in your tour bus and then unload and say, well, this is where he preached his sermon on the level place. This is the level place. That's not quite as common as part of the tour, as showing you where the level place is. In a way, it seems that that's really too bad, because it seemed between here and Lubbock, when I was driving over today, there were any number of places that would qualify for the Sermon on the Level Place. Any number of places. But the Sermon on the Level Place, I want to propose today that it's a little bit different from the Sermon on the Mount in this way. The Sermon on the Mount is more elevated. That makes sense, right? It's on the Mount. It's more spiritual to some degree, if you will. Whereas the Sermon on the Plain, the Sermon on the Level Place, is more mundane and everyday and material, if you will. As for instance, both of them begin with the Beatitudes. Blessed are, that wonderful New Testament word, Makarios. Blessed are. Can also be translated happy. Can be translated spiritually abundant. Blessed are, except the first blessed are, according to Matthew, is blessed are the poor in spirit. And in Luke, blessed are the poor. There's a little bit of a difference there, isn't there? Now, I'm not proposing that one was the original teaching of Jesus and one came later. I think in both cases, these two sermons were probably the gospel writer's collection of Jesus' teachings, which were delivered at various places, some on the level places, some on the mountains, some by the sea, perhaps some in the portico of the temple in Jerusalem, and they were gathered up together into these two summaries of Jesus' teaching. But as I said, the one from Luke, the Sermon on the Level Place, begins with only 4 Beatitudes, whereas Matthew has 12 Beatitudes. Blessed are you poor, he says. Blessed are you who are hungry now. Blessed are you who weep now. Blessed are you when people hate you. Now that's a tough one, isn't it? Blessed are you when people hate you. Those were the 4 Beatitudes found in the Gospel of Luke. And then the mirror image comes, which we see in Luke and not in Matthew, where we have the, if you will, the photographic negative of the Beatitudes, where we have the woes. Woe are you who are rich, it says. Woe are you who are filled now, for you will be hungry later. Now that's a tougher word. We don't get that in Matthew. The photographic negatives of the Beatitudes are the woes. Now I want to be real careful with that for just a minute. I think the woes, in my understanding, are not condemning those who are wealthy necessarily, but it is saying that there are those in this world who are, when the great reversal comes and the kingdom comes, there are those who will be closer and those who will be further away. And probably those who are wealthy, who will be focused on their material things, and may find themselves a little further away when the things of the Spirit come to govern this world. And who are the wealthy? Well, I have the good fortune of being a part of a program. I've retired and live in Lubbock now. Part of a program by which we prepare and deliver food vouchers to people who need food from the South Plains Food Bank. And we gather at a local church, St. John's United Methodist Church, where I'm affiliated, every week, and we give out approximately 100 food vouchers to folks in need. We do that every week. And there's one pleasant man, a middle-aged African-American man, who always comes. You can only come once a month, but he's there every month. And he always comes and he sits across the desk from us, and we're working there on our computer because we have to gather information and get demographic information. And he's always very pleasantly, big smile on his face. And he says, "How are you rich people doing today?" And sometimes he said, "How are you rich people getting along?" And sometimes I try to protest that. "Oh, you know, I'm not rich." And sometimes I just kid him and I say, "You know, it's not too bad. You ought to try it sometime." And he says, "I see you there in that $100 shirt." Well, let me tell you, I don't wear $100 shirts. But it's all relative. It's all relative. And all I have to know to understand what it means to be wealthy in this society is to ask any of those 100 individuals who come through, because we have to record their monthly income. All I have to know that I'm one of the wealthy is to ask those people what their monthly income is. Be careful, you wealthy folks, because the poor may in fact be the ones who are blessed. The Sermon on the Plain begins with the words of blessing. One professor of mine says it's really important, before we get down to the really stringent, difficult teaching, which are part of the readings which we have to deal with today, it's very important to remember that the first word that Jesus proclaims in this sermon is that you are blessed. Blessed. As I had one professor, I don't know if we have any English majors in the room, he said, in Jesus' teaching, the indicative always precedes the imperative. Meaning what is the case in God's realm always precedes the call to obedience. We always get that backwards. We think we have to whomp up Jesus' blessing by just being, "What a good boy am I. Jesus, will you bless me?" I'm not nearly as bad as I could be. Jesus, will you bless me then? I gave out food vouchers this week. Will you bless me? Oh no, we start off blessed. We start off blessed, and through that blessedness, we are given the power to obey. The indicative, the reality of Jesus' gift of blessedness always precedes the call to obedience. Jesus' pronouncement of our blessedness, by which he begins the Sermon on the Plain, always precedes and gives the occasion and power for the new life of obedience. The theology of grace always precedes the ethic of obligation. But then in our passage, we get in and talk about how that ethic of obligation works. Where Jesus says, I say to you that listen, I say to you that listen. Now if you're not listening, I'm not talking to you. That's what he says. I say to you that listen, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you, etc. Love your enemies. This is the call. It's important because in these brief verses, Jesus says it once and then he says it again. Love your enemies. This is a little bit of a different commandment than we hear when Jesus says, by quoting Leviticus in Luke chapter 10, it's also found in the other Gospels and in the letter of James. Love your neighbor as yourself. Of course, he's quoting the Old Testament there from Leviticus. This is a little bit different call than loving your neighbor. You know, sometimes loving your neighbor is hard enough, is it not? Loving your neighbor. Like our neighbor across the street, you know, you got one too. Moved in 6 months ago, chopped down all the trees in the whole yard, front yard, backyard, dug up the grass in the front yard and left a bunch of 6 inches of dirt there in the front yard, and whenever he goes out to check his mail, he's packing a pistol on his hip. They're the ones we're supposed to love. They're our neighbors, but even more than that, we're supposed to love our enemy. You know, it's interesting. I think probably most of us don't think we have enemies. I was in the ministry for many, many years, and I never had a counselee or a member of my church come in and say, I need help figuring out how to love my enemies or get along with my enemies. Most of us think we don't have enemies. Isn't that right? Really? But haven't we learned as a nation? Didn't we start to learn it on 9/11 in 2001? That we have enemies. There are people who hate us so much that they would even go to their own death and try to bring us to our knees. We have enemies. And how are we to respond to our enemies? We're supposed to love them. That's even a deeper love than love of neighbor as yourself. Sometimes we hear the commandment, and I know I've probably preached this at one time or another, probably because you preached as long as I have. I've preached just about everything and called it gospel, you know, really. After all these years, I'm sure I said at one time or another what we've all heard. Well, you have to love yourself first before you have anything with which to love someone else. So we talk about self-love. But this isn't talking about self-love. It's talking about love for the other. Love for the alien. Love for those who are other than we are. Love for those who are different than we are. Love of the enemy. It doesn't talk about self-love. Now we have to be careful. Because if we walk away from self-love, that doesn't mean that we're in a psychological state of self-hate. It's not what it's talking about here. I think the opposite of self-love, when it comes to the ethic of the obligation of Christianity, the opposite is not self-hate, it's self-forgetfulness. Self-forgetfulness. Forgetting the self in order to support and care for the other. That's a pretty high order, isn't it? How in the world can we do that? How in the world do we do that? We do that, according to Luke, by imitating our Father. Imitating our Father. The one who is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Well, how do we in the world do we imitate the Father? None of us want to do that. I knew early on that I couldn't imitate my earthly father, so I decided the best thing for me to do would go off and serve other than somewhere. I didn't want to be second in command at the Pecos Valley Oil Company in Hobbs, New Mexico. I thought I better make my own way in the world. None of us can imitate the Father. You ever heard of Jack Hemingway? Jack Hemingway. His father was a fellow named Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway wrote novels about the Spanish Civil War and about catching the 18-foot marlin in The Old Man in the Sea out in the Gulf Stream, way out in the Gulf Stream. Well, his son Jack wrote about short stories about skeet shooting and trout fishing in Idaho. It's hard to imitate the earthly father, isn't it? Sometimes it doesn't work out very well. But see, we're not asked to imitate our earthly fathers here. We are asked to imitate the Heavenly Father, and then we are given the power to do that because we are among the blessed. We have been given the power and authority. The imitation of the Father's love is not an impossible burden. We have been empowered by God to do what? To be merciful as our Father is merciful. And because of that, enemies can become friends. And because of that, we too can be among those. Now in Christ, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For He is our peace. In His flesh He has made both groups into one and broken down the dividing wall, that is the hostility between us. So whomever that might be for you today, God wants to bring healing. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, for decades, were like two different ends of the same stick. They couldn't get out of each other's way. One moved one way and the other one had to go the other way. Among our founding fathers, they had a special place because Thomas Jefferson basically wrote the Declaration of Independence, while John Adams came back a few years later and cleaned it up and made it practical by basically writing the philosophy behind the Constitution. They were friends when they were ambassadors, Jefferson in France, Adams in England during the Revolutionary War. They came back and they became political rivals because they had completely different political philosophies. Thomas Jefferson believed in the pure democracy of the masses. That majority rule, that the people had integrity, and that the people would make the best decisions. We'd call him a populist today. John Adams, on the other hand, believed that our worst impulses would sometimes take over when we were in power, and thus we had to balance power through three branches of government, with the legislative, with two houses by which they would protect themselves from each other and would sometimes keep us from making rash decisions. These two different philosophies were at war in the early days of our nation, just as Jefferson and Adams were, and probably still are today. John Adams was the second president of the United States who elected after the father of the country, George Washington. He served one term. Jefferson pretty well sat on the sidelines through that and decided to run against him for a second term. When Adams was running for a second term, Adams served one term and was defeated by Thomas Jefferson, who became the third president after Adams' 4 years. And through that process, they became so alienated from each other that they wouldn't speak, they wouldn't write, they wouldn't talk to each other. But then over many years, a mutual friend named Benjamin Rush realized that it was important that these founding fathers get back together and no longer be enemies but become friends. So he managed a reconciliation. For the last several years of their lives, they wrote letters back and forth to each other, which really almost became the history of the founding of our nation. John Adams would write 6 letters for every one of Thomas Jefferson, because he had a lot more to say, I guess. Plus, Jefferson was almost an international celebrity and received correspondence and with visitors from all over the world to come see him and learn at his feet. But over time, they became what they had been enemies, and they became friends again. Until late in their life, when neither of them could write anymore, they had a goal. Each of them had a goal in mind. Jefferson in Virginia, Adams in Massachusetts. And that would be to live to the golden anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. July 4th, 1826. And on that day, John Adams, in his small town in Massachusetts, was almost in a coma, was so weak, and yet in the great celebration, he awakened and he heard the cannons and the shouting and the music. And they asked him if he knew what day it was. He said, "Oh yes, it's the glorious 4th of July, exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence." "God bless this nation," he said. "God bless you all." And then his final words, it's reported, before he passed away on that day: "Jefferson still survived. But in fact, he was wrong. Because Thomas Jefferson had died that same day, 5 hours earlier, at his home, Monticello in Virginia. Those who once were far off had been brought near by their common cause, by their memories, by the unity of their mission, by their friendship. And we too can do the same, regardless of who that enemy is. We are called as the people of God to be among the community of the blessed, to share in the peace which is ours in the blood of Christ, and to learn the gift of the Spirit to be merciful as our true Father is merciful.